Aldara Fernández e Iván del Campo cursan primero de bachillerato en el Instituto Zalaeta de La Coruña. Forman parte de un grupo de alumnos de Tecnología industrial interesados en los temas relacionados con la energía, con el impacto de la actividad humana en el medio ambiente y con las posibles soluciones. En representación de su curso van a realizar una entrevista con Ottmar Edenhofer, copresidente del Grupo de Trabajo 3 del Panel Intergovernamental sobre el Cambio Climático, una institución auspiciada por Naciones Unidas.
¿Cómo empezó su vida profesional? ¿Qué le impulsó a dedicarse a este trabajo? ¿Y cómo llegó al tema del cambio climático?
That's a very good question. So first of all, I studied philosophy and economics and math. And so I did a lot of things before I decided to become a professional in the climate change issue. I did my PhD in economics, and then I got an offer from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, and then I decided to accept this offer because at that time climate change was not very popular, but I thought that it is an important topic and it is worthwhile to be researched.
Usted es economista y en IPCC coordina 3 temas científicos. Es así, pero el IPCC trata temas de ciencia o de economía. ¿Se puede tratar independientemente cuando se habla de cambio climático?
Yeah, this is an important question. Now, first of all, let me explain a little bit what the IPCC is all about. So first of all, the IPCC tries to handle the science policy interface, which means that policymakers and negotiators have specific questions. And the IPCC has been set up in order to get a better understanding of the underlying questions. And basically the IPCC tries to answer 3 questions. The first question is humankind really responsible for the climate change issue? And for 20 years the IPCC tries to answer that questions, and the scientists, the science-based Working Group 1 came up with a very clear conclusion that humankind is mainly responsible for the increase of the global mean temperature caused by burning coal, oil, gas, and by the land use changes, in particular deforestation. This was the main answer for the working group, from the Working Group 1. But there's a second question. The second question is, why should we be concerned about climate change? So why is it a problematic issue when the global mean temperature increases? And this is the Working Group 2 stuff. So they try to explain what happens, like increasing extreme weather events, like increasing droughts in Africa, and so on. And then the third working group, and the third working group tries to find out how to mitigate climate change. What can we do to reduce the emissions? So, and in this working group there are a lot of engineers and economists, because the engineers try to understand what kind of energy system do we need. So can we use coal and gas for the next 10 years? And what does it cost in Europe when we reduce the emissions, and so on. So this is an interdisciplinary effort, and in order to try to answer 3 simple questions: who is responsible for climate change, why should we be concerned about climate change, and what can we do? For these 3 simple questions, you need a body of scientists who tries to explain this to the decision makers and to the negotiators, and it turns out to be an enormously complex issue.
El Premio Nobel de la Paz del año 2007, otorgado al IPCC, ¿influyó en tu vida profesional o personal? ¿Qué importancia tuvo para el IPCC?
It has an enormous relevance. It had an enormous relevance for the IPCC. And it has also a quite strong impact on my personal life. But let me start what was the impact on the IPCC. I never forget the day when one of my collaborators came in my office and he told me that in 2 hours the Nobel Peace Prize Committee will announce that the IPCC got the Nobel Peace Prize. I was almost shocked. And then it turns out this is the truth, that we got the Nobel Peace Prize. And then what was immediately obvious is that at that time, beyond the circles of experts and professionals, nobody knows the IPCC. Even my own mom was not aware that there is such an institution like the IPCC. But now the IPCC, after the Nobel Peace Prize, becomes very, very popular. The expectations has been increased substantially. Everybody believes that the IPCC is a simple truth teller. The IPCC cannot make any mistake. So, and after the Nobel Peace Prize, and in particular after 2002, a lot of people tried to attack the IPCC. So they tried to find mistakes, and admittedly we made mistakes. And you asked the question, how does this change my personal life? So in 2009 and 10, I had a lot of troubles to deal with all the attacks around the world. And I was a lucky man in that sense, because I was not personally attacked, but some of my colleagues have been attacked heavily in a very unfair way, that, and they have been accused that they manipulate the data, which was not true. And some of them have been so heavily attacked that they are at risk that they lose their professional reputation. And personally, this was for many of my colleagues a very dramatic situation.
¿Qué cree que es más importante para solucionar el problema generado por el cambio climático? ¿El labor de los estados o el labor de cada persona en su casa?
Yeah, I have been asked this question very often, and in particular in Germany. And I have to say, I here have an inconvenient message. I think the most important level of action are at the state level, at the international level. So individuals can do something because you vote your politicians, you elect your politicians, you have some influence in the public arena. And you're a consumer. So, but nevertheless, the most important thing is at the state level, because the climate problem is a global problem, and it has to be solved in one way or another at a global scale.
¿Cree que el ser humano podrá reducir la producción de residuos, tanto gaseosos como sólidos o líquidos, y mantener el sistema consumista al que los países más adelantados del planeta están acostumbrados?
That's a very important question. And here the important question is, in particular for many Europeans, do we need in the future economic growth? I believe that we can handle our waste problems, we can even handle our CO2 problems. And so we might decide in Europe that we will not earn so much money and we are less greedy, that's fine. But we should have in mind the following fact, which is not very much acknowledged in Europe. Many countries on this planet Earth, in particular China, India, but Africa also, need for the next 5 decades fundamental and substantial economic growth. And we should not debate the climate change and the climate policy issue in a way that we Europeans or we Americans try to forbid China, India to escape the poverty trap. I think this is a very fundamental issue, and what we can see in the data is that economic growth is in particular important for the poorest people on planet Earth. So what we have to show is that in the next decade, so to say, that we are able as a humankind, and here Europe can contribute a lot because of the technology and the education system, that we can decouple economic growth from the emission growth. 3 weeks ago, I had a meeting in Washington where we present the first results of the IPCC. And people from Africa, in particular from Africa, not from China and India, but from Africa, said Africa would like to have an economic growth rate above 5%. Currently they have 5%, and they have a strong intention to develop, and they clearly said, we are willing to contribute to the climate policy, but we are not willing to accept that the Europeans or the Americans or industrialized countries impose a climate policy on us, which does not allow us to overcome poverty.
Como miembro del IPCC y como profesor universitario, ¿considera adecuada la formación científico-tecnológica de la población en la actualidad? ¿Cree que sería conveniente una mejor formación científico-tecnológica en los ciudadanos para mejorar nuestro mundo?
I think so. I think in particular, so we have to do 2 things. First, to improve the training. I'm a professor at the Technical University to convince people that natural science, math, physics, chemistry, but also economics and statistics is an important part of our daily life, so to say, and you cannot understand the modern world without science, and even you cannot understand the modern world without economics. I'm deeply convinced about this. This is one level, but there's another level, and this is widely ignored. We have to explain a little bit more what does this mean to be a modern person. What does it mean to develop a modern identity, and how our insights in science, in technologies, is related to our value systems. I think that's quite important, because many people believe that there is the world of facts, the world of science, and there's another world, which is about the value systems, about ethical reasonings. And this is one issue, which is quite important in the current IPCC meeting we have in Vigo. We are really working hard, and we have heated debates how facts and values are interlinked. I give you just one example. So many people show within the IPCC that a low stabilization scenario requires a lot of bioenergy and biofuels. Other people say, okay, if you try to employ a lot of bioenergy beyond, let's say, 200 exajoule per year, you have an impact, a strong impact on a reduced food security and so on. So how to value this? This is not a scientific issue. This is an issue about the value systems, about ethical reasoning. And I would say we have to train people at both levels. At the science level, people has to understand the substance of the science, the substance of mathematical reasoning, but at the same time, we should train people to improve the ethical reasoning and to think about ethical issues, large-scale ethical issues, in a much more professional way than they did in the past.
¿Cree que con la crisis que estamos viviendo actualmente sería una opción a tener en cuenta el regreso al campo?
This is not an option at all. And I would like to tell you why. So, back to the countryside with the current technology will not work. It will not work in Africa, it will not work in China, it will not work in India. And we should never forget, I'm not saying that the Chinese economics model will be sustainable for the next 20 years. China is in a very, very complicated situation. But the fact that we have reduced the poorest people in absolute terms over the last 10 years, this was due to the fact of the transformation pathway in China. And in China in particular, this means that people are migrating from the countryside, from the rural areas, into the cities. And even in Africa, we see a huge urbanization movement. In the next 5 decades, so to say, we will see emergent large-scale cities, not mega cities, but large-scale cities, around 3 million people, in particular in Africa, and people like to live in cities. From my point of view, we should not go back to the countryside, but what we should do is we should make our cities much more sustainable.
¿Qué nos podría explicar acerca del efecto invernadero que nos sorprendiera?
I assume that you know everything about the greenhouse gases and nothing can surprising you, but probably it might be interesting to learn that when we think about greenhouse gases, we have to think about the global commons problem, because greenhouse gases have 2 components. On the one hand, it's the flow of greenhouse gases, so the flow of greenhouse gases which we release into the atmosphere, but this has an impact on other global commons, on the oceans, for example, on the forests, on land. I would like to give you a few examples. Due to the fact that we increase the stock, the accumulated amount of carbon into the atmosphere, this leads to an acidification of the ocean. The acidification of the ocean has a strong impact on the marine ecosystems, which might reduce in the future the capability of the marine ecosystems to provide food. And at the same time, we see that the carbon sinks, the terrestrial, so-called terrestrial carbon sink, like the forests and like land, has also a reduced capability to absorb CO2. So by and large, to understand the carbon cycle is a very complicated issue, and what we can see is that the absorptive capacity of the atmosphere, of the ocean and the land is slightly reducing over time, which is a quite worrying issue because we transform our whole planetary system in a way which is unprecedented for the last, I would say, 50,000 years for the whole Holocene, for the whole cultural history of humankind. So we are undertaking a large-scale geophysical experiment with a quite uncertain outcome. Hopefully this surprises you a little bit.
Si el uso de las energías renovables es una solución, ¿por qué aún no están generalizadas?
First of all, in all the scenarios we see that renewables will play an important role, and as you might know that in Germany we have now a decision, the so-called phase out of nuclear power, and we try to replace nuclear power with renewables, and not only nuclear power but also the fossil fuels. But we have to admit that currently the renewables are much more expensive than fossil fuels, and therefore what we have to do is we have to change the price relationship between the renewables and in particular the fossil fuels. And this is a quite challenging issue, and I think what we need in the future is a convincing European policy, so that many other countries like Spain, you have a huge potential for renewables, like Italy will deploy then at a large scale level renewables. And by the way, you are so blessed, so to say, with the sun that you can export electricity to the northern part of Europe. And I think partially this could solve our euro crisis, because there are some there's a disequilibrium between the countries, and this could help us a little bit to equilibrate the relationship between the countries.